None of us could have imagined that in the next 20 minutes we would witness something that would shatter our understanding of reality and set in motion events that would affect not just our lives, but the lives of our families, our community, and eventually thousands of people around the world who would hear our story and realize they weren't alone. My name is Betty Cash, and this is my story that needs to be told. I was 51 years old on December 29, 1980, a successful businesswoman who owned and operated my own restaurant in Dayton, Texas, about 25 miles northeast of Houston. I had worked my entire adult life to build that business from nothing, saving every penny and working 16-hour days to create something I could be proud of as an independent woman in East Texas. I was driving my Oldsmobile Cutlass that evening with my close friend Vickie Landrum and her 7-year-old grandson Colby, returning home after we'd gone out to dinner at a restaurant in nearby New Caney to check out what the competition was doing. It was around 9 o'clock and getting cold, typical December weather for our part of Texas, with a light fog starting to roll in from the Gulf of Mexico as we took the back roads through the dense piney woods on Farm Road 1485. I remember feeling relaxed and content, talking with Vickie about business and watching little Colby doze off in the back seat. 3 ordinary people living ordinary lives on what seemed like an ordinary winter evening. What happened that night would turn us into reluctant witnesses to something extraordinary, unwilling participants in a mystery that continues to this day, and living proof that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that need to be believed. We were driving south on Farm Road 1485 through the thick pine forest when little Colby first spotted it from the back seat. "What's that, Grandma?" he said, pointing toward the horizon where a vertical streak of red light had appeared in the dark December sky. At first, Vickie and I thought he was asking about something we'd been discussing, but when we looked where he was pointing, we saw this glow that seemed to be getting bigger and brighter as we drove toward it. I remember thinking it might be a tower with warning lights or maybe a helicopter, something completely normal that would have an easy explanation, but as we got closer, the light became so intense, it was like staring into the sun. When we rounded the next curve, I had to hit the brakes hard because there it was, right in front of us, hovering maybe 130 feet above the road and completely blocking our path. I'll never forget that first moment when I realized what we were looking at wasn't anything from this world. The object was enormous, easily as big as the water tower in Dayton, shaped like a huge upright diamond with its top and bottom cut off flat instead of coming to points. The whole thing was made of some kind of dull metallic silver material that glowed with an intensity that hurt to look at directly, and around the middle section there were small blue lights blinking in sequence like some kind of control panel. But the most terrifying part was the fire. Every few seconds, massive flames would blast downward from the bottom of the craft, creating this enormous cone of fire that extended maybe 60 feet toward the road. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, like opening an oven door and sticking your face inside, except 1,000 times worse. I could feel it burning my skin through the windshield, and when I rolled down my window to get a better look, the blast of superheated air nearly knocked me backwards. Each time the flames erupted, this tremendous whooshing sound filled the air, like the loudest air brakes on a semi-truck, and the entire object would rise up 20 or 30 feet before settling back down when the flames subsided. I was absolutely mesmerized by this incredible sight, so I got out of the car to see it better, which was the biggest mistake of my life. The heat outside was indescribable, like standing next to a blast furnace, and I could feel my face and hands starting to burn almost immediately. The metal of my car was already too hot to touch with bare skin, and I had to use my coat to protect my hands from the door handle. Meanwhile, Vickie had gotten out too, but Colby was screaming in terror from the back seat, crying and begging us to get back in the car and drive away. "Let's go, Grandma, let's go." He kept sobbing, and I could hear the pure fear in that little boy's voice. but I couldn't tear myself away from this impossible thing hovering above us. Vickie quickly got back in to comfort Colby, but I stood there for what felt like hours, watching this craft struggle to rise above the tree line. Every time the flames would die down to just a glow, it would start to sink toward the road, and then another massive burst of fire would shoot out and lift it back up. It was like watching something that was damaged or malfunctioning, fighting against gravity but not quite able to escape. The heat was so intense that the vinyl dashboard in my car started to soften and melt, and when Vickie tried to steady herself by putting her hand on it, her handprint pressed right into the material and stayed there for weeks afterward. Then suddenly, just as I was thinking this thing might actually crash down on top of us, it began to rise up above the trees and gain altitude. But that's when the real terror began, because as it climbed higher into the sky, we heard the sound of helicopters approaching from every direction, and within minutes, we were surrounded by what had to be the most massive military operation I'd ever seen. The helicopters came from everywhere at once, filling the night sky with the deafening sound of rotor blades and the brilliant glare of searchlights that swept back and forth across the forest canopy. I had never seen anything like it in my life. There had to be at least 20, maybe 25 military helicopters converging on our location from every direction, flying in tight formation like they were escorting the object. Most of them looked like those big double-rotor Chinooks that the Army uses, but there were also smaller ones that I later learned were probably Huey helicopters, all painted in dark military colors without any visible markings or identification numbers. What frightened me most was how organized and coordinated everything seemed. These weren't helicopters rushing to investigate something unexpected. They were clearly part of whatever was happening, following the object in perfect formation as it began moving slowly toward the southeast. Vickie was screaming at me through the car window to get back inside, and Colby was crying even harder now because the noise from all those helicopters was absolutely deafening, like being inside a cement mixer. I could feel the downdraft from their rotor blades pushing me around, and pine needles and debris were flying through the air like we were in the middle of a tornado. But I couldn't stop watching this incredible procession moving across the sky above us. The diamond-shaped craft was still belching fire every few seconds, rising and falling with each burst of flames, while this enormous convoy of military aircraft escorted it like they were protecting some kind of VIP transport. The whole thing was moving slowly, maybe 30 or 40 miles per hour, giving me plenty of time to count the helicopters and study their formation. I remember thinking that whatever this craft was, the military clearly knew about it and was involved in whatever was happening. Finally, when the heat became so unbearable that my coat started smoking, I managed to tear myself away and get back into the car. My hands and face felt like I'd been sunbathing for hours without sunscreen, and when I tried to grab the steering wheel, the metal was so hot I had to wrap my sleeves around my hands to protect them. Vickie was holding Colby, trying to comfort him while he sobbed against her shoulder, and she was staring at me with this look of absolute terror that I'd never seen on her face before. "Betty, what was that thing?" she whispered, but I had no answer for her. All I knew was that we needed to get away from there as fast as possible, so I started the engine and began following the convoy at a distance, driving slowly because my vision was blurry and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. For the next several miles, we watched this impossible parade moving through the night sky, this massive craft surrounded by military helicopters, all heading toward Houston like it was the most normal thing in the world. The last thing I remember before we lost sight of them was seeing the formation disappear over the horizon, leaving us alone on that dark country road with the smell of burning metal and the sound of Colby's frightened whimpering, filling our car. The drive home was a nightmare that seemed to last forever, even though it was probably only 30 minutes. All three of us started feeling sick almost immediately after we lost sight of the object and helicopters. Colby was the first to complain. saying his stomach hurt and that he felt like he was going to throw up, which he did twice on the side of the road, while Vickie held his head and tried to keep him calm. The poor little boy was so scared and confused, asking over and over again what that thing was and why it made him feel so bad, and neither Vickie nor I had any answers for him. But I was feeling the worst effects by far, probably because I'd spent the most time outside the car exposed to whatever radiation or energy that craft was putting out. My face felt like I'd stuck it in a campfire, with this deep burning sensation that went all the way down to the bone, and my hands were starting to swell up and turn bright red, like the worst sunburn I'd ever had. Every time I blinked, my eyes felt like they were full of sand, and I was having trouble focusing on the road because everything looked blurry and hazy. The metallic taste in my mouth was getting stronger too, like I'd been sucking on pennies, and I could feel this horrible nausea building in my stomach that made me want to pull over and vomit. Vickie wasn't much better off. She kept touching her face and neck, saying it felt like she was burning up from the inside out, and her hair looked strange in the car's dome light, like it was somehow duller and brittle compared to how it had looked earlier that evening. Little Colby had developed this angry red rash across his cheek and forehead, and he kept scratching at it even though Vickie told him not to. The strangest thing was that all of us were experiencing the same symptoms at the same time: the burning skin, the nausea, the metallic taste, and this overwhelming exhaustion that made it hard to think clearly. By the time we reached Vickie's house in Dayton, I could barely get out of the car. My legs felt like jelly and I was dizzy and disoriented, like I had the worst flu of my life combined with the most severe sunburn imaginable. Vickie helped me to her front door, and when we got inside and she turned on the lights, we both gasped at what we saw. My face was bright red and already starting to blister in places, particularly around my eyes and on my forehead, where I'd been exposed to the heat the longest. Vickie's face was red too, but not nearly as bad as mine, and little Colby's rash had spread down his neck and onto his arms. We all looked like we'd been roasted alive, and the worst part was that we could tell this was just the beginning. Whatever had happened to us out there on that road, the effects were going to get much worse before they got better. The next 3 days were pure hell as our symptoms got progressively worse in ways that defied medical explanation. I barely slept at all the first night, because every time I laid my head on the pillow, the burning sensation in my face would intensify until it felt like someone was holding a blowtorch against my skin. By morning, huge water blisters had formed across my forehead and cheeks, making me look like I'd been in a house fire. When I tried to eat breakfast, everything tasted like metal and made me so nauseous that I spent most of the morning hunched over the toilet. But the most terrifying thing was watching my hair fall out in clumps every time I touched my head. Within 48 hours, I had lost almost half the hair on my scalp, and what remained looked brittle and gray. The hair on my arms and legs was falling out too, leaving behind red, irritated patches that itched constantly but hurt too much to scratch. I had never experienced anything like this in my 51 years of life, and I was starting to panic because I knew this wasn't normal sunburn. Vickie was having similar problems, though not quite as severe as mine. Her face was swollen and red, and she'd developed strange dark patches around her eyes that made her look like she'd been beaten up. She complained constantly about headaches that felt like ice picks being driven into her skull, and she was having trouble keeping food down too. But what worried her most was little Colby, who seemed to be getting sicker by the hour. The poor child had developed a high fever that wouldn't break no matter what medication Vickie gave him, and the red rash on his face had spread down his neck and across his chest in angry welts that looked infected. He kept crying and saying his eyes hurt, and when we looked closely, we could see that the whites of his eyes were bloodshot and irritated. Colby was also having trouble sleeping because of nightmares about the object and the helicopters, waking up several times each night screaming about the fire in the sky. By the third day, I couldn't even get out of bed without help. The diarrhea had started on day 2, and was so severe that I was becoming dehydrated, and the vomiting was almost constant now, leaving me weak and dizzy whenever I tried to stand up. My hands had swollen to twice their normal size and were covered in painful blisters, and my fingernails were starting to turn black and fall off one by one. When Vickie called her family doctor to describe what we were going through, he told her it sounded like severe radiation poisoning and that we needed to get to a hospital immediately. That's when we finally admitted to ourselves that whatever we'd encountered on that dark country road had done something terrible to us, something that was slowly destroying our bodies from the inside out. On January 3rd, 1981, just 4 days after our encounter, Vickie finally managed to get me to the emergency room at Parkway Hospital in Houston. I couldn't walk on my own and had to be wheeled in on a gurney, my face so swollen and disfigured that the intake nurse asked if I'd been in a car accident or house fire. Large patches of my skin were literally falling off my face and scalp in sheets, leaving raw bleeding areas underneath that were too painful to touch. Dr. Brian McClelland was the physician assigned to my case, and I'll never forget the look of confusion and concern on his face when he first saw me. He later told reporters that my symptoms were consistent with acute radiation poisoning, estimating that I'd been exposed to somewhere between 1 and 2 grays of radiation, not enough to kill me outright, but certainly enough to cause severe and lasting damage to my body. What puzzled him most was the rapid onset of symptoms, because radiation sickness usually takes days or weeks to manifest the kind of severe skin damage and hair loss I was experiencing. The next 12 days in that hospital were a blur of pain, medical tests, and mounting confusion as doctors tried to figure out what had happened to me. I was given IV fluids for dehydration, powerful pain medications that barely touched the agony in my skin, and antibiotics to prevent infection in the areas where my flesh was sloughing off. My hair continued falling out in clumps every time I moved my head, and by the end of the first week, I had lost more than half of it. The hospital staff kept running different tests: blood work, skin biopsies, cultures, radiation level measurements, but nothing could explain the severity or combination of my symptoms. My white blood cell count was dangerously low, which is consistent with radiation exposure, but the doctors couldn't understand how I could have been exposed to that much radiation without dying within days. What made everything worse was that the hospital administrators started acting strangely after the first week. Dr. McClelland later told investigators that he repeatedly requested my complete medical records from that initial hospitalization, but the hospital never complied with his requests. He suspected that my records had been classified or confiscated by government agencies. When I was finally discharged on January 15th, I was still weak, nauseated, and experiencing severe pain throughout my body. The doctors told me to follow up with my primary care physician and hoped that my symptoms would gradually improve, but they warned me that radiation exposure could have long-term effects that might not manifest for months or years. Vickie and little Colby were also struggling with ongoing health problems. Vickie had developed painful eye problems and was losing weight, and by April 1981, she was diagnosed with cataracts. Colby's rash had mostly cleared up, but he was having trouble sleeping and was constantly getting sick, like his immune system had been compromised. The most frustrating part was that none of the doctors could give us a definitive diagnosis or treatment plan. They all agreed that our symptoms were consistent with radiation exposure, but they couldn't explain where that radiation had come from. When it became clear that our medical bills were going to bankrupt all 3 families, we reached out to our senators for help. Both offices were polite but ultimately unhelpful, directing us to contact the Air Force directly. The Air Force response was swift and predictable. They had no record of any military aircraft operating in that area on December 29, 1980, and suggested we might have misidentified civilian helicopters. When we pressed them about the formation of 20-plus aircraft we'd witnessed, they simply repeated that no military operations had taken place. Our Freedom of Information Act requests were either denied outright or came back so heavily redacted that they were useless. NASA refused to even acknowledge our case existed, claiming their files were classified for national security reasons. After months of bureaucratic runaround and form letters that all said essentially the same thing, we have no information about your alleged incident. It became clear that if we wanted any kind of justice, we were going to have to take the government to court. In 1982, we filed a lawsuit against the United States government for $20 million. Our attorney argued that military aircraft had been involved in whatever we'd witnessed, and that the government was responsible for our radiation exposure. The case dragged on for 4 years while our medical conditions continued to deteriorate. I was hospitalized 15 more times for complications, eye problems, recurring skin cancers, digestive issues that left me unable to work. But on August 21, 1986, Federal Judge Ross Sterling dismissed our case, ruling that we had failed to prove government involvement. After 6 years of fighting, spending every penny on legal fees and medical bills, we had nothing except continued declining health. The years after the court case were the darkest of my life. My health continued to deteriorate in ways that seemed to accelerate after we lost our lawsuit, as if the stress and disappointment had broken something fundamental in my body's ability to heal itself. By 1987, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and the doctors immediately connected it to the radiation exposure I'd experienced 7 years earlier. The chemotherapy treatments left me even weaker and more fragile, but I was determined to keep fighting, not just for my life, but for recognition of what had really happened to us that December night. I sold my restaurant in 1989 because I could no longer work the long hours required to run a business. The medical bills from my cancer treatments, combined with the ongoing costs of treating the chronic health problems that never went away, had bankrupted me completely. I moved into a small apartment and lived on disability payments, spending most of my time writing letters to journalists, researchers, and anyone who would listen to our story. Vickie was struggling too. Her cataracts had gotten worse, requiring multiple surgeries, and she'd developed the same kinds of immune system problems that plagued me. Little Colby, now grown up, rarely talked about what happened that night, but his mother told me he still had nightmares sometimes about the fire in the sky and the sound of all those helicopters. What hurt the most wasn't the physical pain or even the financial ruin. It was the complete indifference of the world to our suffering. We had documentation, medical records, photographs, and witness testimony, but none of it mattered to the people who could have helped us. We were just 3 unlucky people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the system had decided we didn't deserve justice or even acknowledgement of what we'd endured. I'm telling this story now because I know my time is running out. The cancer has spread throughout my body, and the doctors say I have maybe a few months left. It's December 1998. Almost exactly 18 years since that night changed everything. And I want people to know that what happened to us was real, documented and covered up by people who cared more about national security than human lives. The saddest part is that our case wasn't unique. Over the years, I received letters from dozens of other people who had similar encounters with unidentified craft and military helicopters, people who suffered the same kinds of radiation injuries and government denials that we experienced. There's a pattern here that goes far beyond 3 people on a country road in Texas, but nobody wants to investigate it because it's easier to dismiss us all as crazy or attention-seeking. Vickie continues to battle her own health problems, still insisting that we told the truth about everything we witnessed. Little Colby is a grown man now, with children of his own, and he still remembers every detail of that terrifying night when something from another world nearly killed his grandmother and the woman who was like a second mother to him. I may die without ever getting the justice or recognition we deserved, but I hope that someday, when the government finally admits what they've been hiding, people will remember Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and little Colby as the ones who told the truth when nobody wanted to hear it.